Hola ballers, what's going on? It's Preacher. Now this video is going to be looking at the starting developments of what is going to be a big storm over the next couple of weeks. You might not be aware of it yet, that's cool, that's why I'm here. Now I was going to put this out to the Raiders because there's going to be a lot of mathy stuff involved here which might not resonate well with a lot of the audience. Now don't worry about it, I'm not going to go too much into it because honestly it's massive. But overall, this should be a good change, although on the face of it, it looks like a really terrible thing. Alright, so stay with me and we'll be okay. So let's get into it then. What we've seen is that 715 has begun. Something that was announced, the devs did talk about it, is the attempt to crush the power of secondary stats in terms of comparing them to your main stats. So that would be things like haste, crit, versatility versus things like intellect, agility, and so on and so forth. So we know, we're all very aware of the problem. In fact, we've been lolling about it on the channel for quite some time. And it seems that these problems and Legion's other niggling problems are having effect. As we've seen, numbers from the data we can gather has dramatically dropped back down to Warlords of Draenor levels, almost. And these are the kind of things people need to fix, particularly when most of the player base is so derived onto item level and constantly being told by people such as myself and other people who understand how the mechanics of the games work is that isn't necessarily a good thing and going at each other backwards and forwards. So for a while now, people have been saying that this system is fucking stupid. It is. It goes against common sense. There's no reason I should have a significant item level upgrade and not be able to equip it. That doesn't make any goddamn sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. So 715 is hoping to address this and a number of other concerns. So before we get into that, what are the other concerns? Another concern that Blizzard clearly has right now, which is of their own doing, is that we are hugely powerful way too early in this expansion. Way too early. They've been guilty of power creep several times. And now they've gone even worse than ever before. We are essentially playing end of expansion geared characters. If you are a raider and you're up to mythic TOV level, you're absolutely playing a character that is already reaping the benefits that we wouldn't ordinarily see until the end of the expansion. That's a big problem because we're not even through the first tier of raiding. We still have several more to go, and God knows where we're looking to be. In some general terms, we can see that my mage, for example, will do sometimes upwards of 10 times the damage of other people in a heroic. When I do my daily heroic for AP or whatever, it'd be 10 times as much damage as another player. We're even looking at a point in a sort of theoretical sense where if I'm in the group with appropriately geared players for doing their first heroics and getting gear from heroics, we're essentially 14-manning bosses at that point. Yeah, that's how absurd it is. We are essentially 14-manning bosses at that point, or even 13 or 12-manning heroic bosses, and it's just not viable that there should be 100 item level difference between a freshly capped character and somebody who hasn't finished or fully geared. I'm nowhere near fully geared comparison. I'm 10 item levels below people in my own raid group, for God's sake. But these are the results we're seeing right now. Yeah, these are the kind of things that we are seeing right now. And this is, of course, a big problem. So what are they doing to fix this power creep? Well, they're squishing pretty much everybody in terms of a lot of things. 715 is bringing in a huge amount of micro changes across the board. So you're seeing things like all melee are losing basically a flat 5% crit that was already built into the class. They're just going to knock that back down. They're going to diminish other things. And another thing they're doing is devaluing the gains you get from secondary stats. Now, a big part of that as well should mean that higher item level items should now be worth considering. Should be worth considering. For the most part, we're going to get into the problems in a second. Believe me, this is a very difficult video for me to produce for you guys. This is what they're trying to achieve. They're trying to achieve a semblance. They've set a line at about 15 item levels, that anything above 15 item levels should be an upgrade regardless, right? It should be an upgrade. So if you get a helm that's like 20 item levels above what you previously had, it should be an upgrade regardless of the secondary stats. And the way they're doing that is saying that, well, now you get less benefit from secondary stats. So if you copy your character right now to the PTR, you will see just less. You have less haste, you have less mastery, you have less versatility, you have less crit. You just have less. Some stats more so than others. So if you lost base crit like the melee did, or all the crit bonuses that fire mages have lost, so you will see dramatic differences in one area, but overall you should see less in every single area of your secondary stats. But But what they're countering that with is just making your main stats more powerful. Therefore, you should be doing, in an ideal world, and I'm using this loosely until we get into the more difficult areas of this video, you should see that because you're hitting harder, because you have more agility, more strength, more intellect, then it should be okay. You don't crit as often, but your spells hit harder, so you should be okay. Now, this is what they're going to try and achieve by the end of the 715 tuning process. That's what they're trying to achieve, right? That's the goal. We're not there yet. Nowhere near there yet. Everybody's just getting the hits at the moment, right? And all we're seeing across the board is some tweaks and buffs. So we have to bear in mind that this process isn't finished yet. And that's something I don't want to see people losing their mind and re-rolling or quitting the game in the comments, because we're underway in this process, but it's a process you should be aware of. You should absolutely be aware of this, and you should now be definitely, if you weren't already, banking higher item level gear, because it might turn out that if your dependency is on critical strike, that haste mastery item that's significantly higher item level that's currently sat in your bank will actually be something you want to equip when 715 actually lands, right? This is what you're going to hopefully see. So I'm using words like hopefully, and bear in mind, and wait, and don't panic. There are classes where this is a significant problem, particularly if you have breakpoints. Breakpoints, what are they? I'm finding a lot of people, after browsing a lot of threads on this and talking a hell of a lot with other players about this directly, is that the breakpoints and stat weights are quite I mean, you have to be very invested into the game to really understand that. For the most part, many of you listening to this, at least the vast majority of the player base, will go, what are my best stats? What order, right? So that might be haste, mastery, verse, crit. In that order. Get haste, get mastery, get verse, get crit. And that's all they want to know, and that's as much as anybody needs to know, right? For the most part, you can get by just fine with that little piece of knowledge. Then we go into what are my stat weights. If you're starting to sim your character, and especially with the way Legion's gearing works, is you're trying to work out what is the best. So you'll come up with stat weights like haste is worth 1.1, and crit is worth 0.9, and then you can kind of work out where the actual weight of an item lies. You can give it a theoretical number, and then apply that to your character. Okay, well, what about breakpoints? Breakpoints are a different matter. Certain classes have what's called a breakpoint. Your class might not have one. That's fine and dandy. Your class might not have one. But what you'll find is a breakpoint is something like, on a Fury Warrior, during its major cooldown of Battle Cry, if you reach a certain amount of haste, you get to definitely do one extra attack while under the effects of the Battle Cry buff, right? You reach a certain amount of haste and that becomes possible. Below that, it's not possible. You have this breakpoint. Now, several classes have breakpoints like this, okay? For rogues, it might be a certain amount of crit, which guarantees a regular income of combo points. Below that crit, it does not. For fire mages, it might be something that you can predict reliably, that in a Rune of Power, for example, you will get mini combustions that I talked about in the fire mage guide. Below that amount of crit, which is usually about 60 odd, you can't do that. It's not reliable enough, and your gameplay changes. And this is the important thing to take away. Your gameplay changes. Your character no longer works the same way. Now, when this change comes in, if you are at your breakpoint right now, you're not going to be when this patch comes in. And it might not even be available to you. Now, if the whole aim of this patch is to make primary stats more valuable, what about those classes with breakpoints? It's a very, very good question. This could theoretically exacerbate the problem that those specs have, because it doesn't matter if they make intellect, let's say we're a Moonkin and we're hitting a haste breakpoint. That haste breakpoint might be worth something like 50k DPS, right? And you might think I'm exaggerating there. I'm not. I'm really not. Some breakpoints are very, very, very powerful. Very, very, very powerful. It doesn't matter if they make intellect worth slightly more if that breakpoint no longer exists, because it's not going to push, it's not going to be enough to make up for this breakpoint's power. And therefore, we could have the problem where secondary stats, in fact, become more valuable than they already are. And you're probably looking at yourself going, how is that possible? It is possible. It is absolutely possible that they could become even more powerful than they already are. And that is a legitimate concern. Do we have the answer for those concerns yet? No. No, we don't. We could talk about potential solutions at the end of the video. But as it stands, no, we don't have an answer for that. For those classes that do rely on breakpoints for significant DPS gains, this system looks pretty bad. We don't know, and I would like to see it, if primary stats are going to return to jewelry, because this will make jewelry even more of a problem for plenty of classes. Not only that, we also have to bear in mind that for certain specs, such as fire, such as rogues, such as moonkins, such as demon hunters, that the loss of the secondary stats is actually something that defines their entire gameplay. And this reduction actually really screws up how they play. Now, in response to that, part of me kind of sides with the idea that we shouldn't have been there yet anyway. But we are. And what I mean by that is, at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that we're kind of playing our characters as we would be playing them at end of expansion, given how high our secondary stats actually are. We're talking really, really high values of secondary stats in terms of what they're actually giving us. We're seeing mages with like 65 to 68% critical strike rating. We're seeing other characters equally as high in their own preferred stats. And that's not something we should have ordinarily seen. Now, Blizzard did make this change intentionally, okay? They know that certain classes don't play well until they hit a certain value of a secondary stat. They don't play well. So, classically, a fire mage would be god-awful useless until it hit a certain value of crit because it just wouldn't perform well enough. It just wouldn't play as it's supposed to play. It's supposed to have regular critical strike in order to make it work. So, they upped all these secondary stats to get the players to a point where their character would play properly. Now, of course, what we've seen is that escalate and unfold massively to the point where power creep is now utterly insane. And it does need... I kind of sympathize slightly. This is their own fault. We're not going to brush aside that. But I do sympathize with the fact that where could we go from here? Where do we go over the next two raid tiers? We can't have this getting much more out of hand, or it will just be utterly absurd. The game would be realistically broken. Combining the fact with artifact power gains and legendary gains over the course of the expansion and so on and so forth. The game would quite literally be broken in certain cases, and that's not something they can afford. But again, it's their fault, right? We have to get that fault. I would rather this change happen now, and it's essentially a stat squish, to bring people back to almost a pre-raid position. So that's where they're trying to get you, into a pre-raid position again, even though you've already experienced it. Now, a good point raised is what happens to bosses if this happens. Because there are certain specs and certain classes that are nowhere near going to perform as well as they do now when 715 lands. Right? Unless they get it absolutely perfect. I hope they do. And I'm always going to keep that optimism that they might nail it and everybody comes out with pretty much the same damage, but the gameplay's slightly different is kind of the best result we can hope for at this point. That might be enough to turn some of you off. I get that. But that's what they're hoping to achieve, is whatever your damage is now, it should be the same when 715 comes out, but your gameplay is slightly different. You might attack slightly slower, you might crit less, you might have less mastery, and so on and so forth, but your damage should be the same because they've made things like intellect, agi, and strength better to compensate from this lack of secondary stats. I just wanted to be clear to point out that, yes, certain classes are far more dependent on secondary stats than others, and that's something that needs to be addressed, and hopefully it will be. So what happens to content? And the big one, of course, at the moment would be Guam Mythic. Guam Mythic is no fucking joke, man. No joke whatsoever in terms of its DPS requirements if you're progressing that thing. We can't say yet, but it's absolutely something to be addressed, is that there might be content that becomes almost undoable. I mean, it's hard to say right now because we're still in the development cycle, and this is what they're trying to reach, is that it shouldn't be a big deal. Is that it shouldn't be a big deal in terms of what your raw numbers out are. Although I kind of feel, I mean, I don't know how the rest of you feel, I'd love to see your thoughts on this, is that damage is way, way too high. I shouldn't be capable of, and I know it's a short-term fight, fire mage, whatever, but a short-term fight that I'm doing 10 to 11 times in some cases more damage than any other individual player in the group. That seems way absurdly high for me in the first raid tier. It does. I don't recall it ever being that high when people were doing appropriate content. At the end of the expansion, sure, maybe even mid-expansion. Yeah, definitely. But in the first tier, I don't recall really doing that in Highmall. I mean, I can't remember. I should check my videos, but perhaps. But we are power creeping very, very quickly. Very, 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 very quickly. As it comes to the conclusion on this and how this, I mean, like, I've purposely left out the math of what the changes are in terms of how they're normalizing them stuff. Suggestions on how they could go about this differently are certainly popping up. And the big one, of course, is reforging. If the entire aim of this process is to make it so that item level is more valuable, as it should be, as it absolutely should be. Your item level should be a key factor in whether or not something is an upgrade because it is a better quality item. Reforging should come back. I don't see the negative of it now. If reforging was available, this would not be anywhere near as big of a deal, but they seem to be like, no, we're not bringing that back. Perhaps they almost see that as admitting failure. As much as I wouldn't like to be a pessimist on that subject, but if they are forced to like, okay, we're going to have to bring Reforging back, we fucked it up, they might not want that to happen. I think they might want to hold that back. On top of that, I think it's about time we got the primary stats back on the rings and stuff. There's no reason someone should have a ring that does purely of one secondary stat because that stat is so good. It would make these things way more interesting if jewelry wasn't this outlier, strange system. And we know they're capable of redoing a vast quantity of items very, very quickly. They've done it historically in the past where they reassigned all the stats on certain items. In fact, we see it when secondary stats are removed. It's not just like a flat swap to something else. They generally like reevaluate it to keep it the same thing. They just put it through a number cruncher, I assume, and say, change this. Here's the stat weights, essentially, because they use stat weights as well, and they plug it through a machine and the new numbers are kicked out. I think it's about time we did that to stop jewelry being so absurd. Because it really is absurd. I only recently was able, despite having an 882 character, was able to replace an 850 necklace. We're talking 32. In fact, my character has in his bank 889 gear. My equipped is 882, but I have 889, and I'm still wearing an 850 piece of jewelry. That's a 40 item level difference. And it doesn't matter what other people tell me. It's like, there's no way that's possible, Preacher. Absolutely is. Absolutely is and was, and was only recently able to actually replace it with a mythic Xavius item. That's an end tier boss, mythic hardest difficulty, which is just how silly this stuff is, and hopefully fix it. My other concern of this is how this will affect the player base. Because it's all very well and good, people who are very, very experienced with WoW and have had a succession of power resets every expansion and so on and so forth to say, yeah, you know what, I know that in 3 months' time I'll be back to kind of where I am now, and then we'll be moving into the end game, and that's okay, right? Most long-term players will be fully aware of that, and anybody who's been a casual for many years won't really care too much, because it doesn't really affect them too much. But for players who are power hungry, of which there is a significant proportion, right? Of people who want to continuously progress their character and increase their power and increase their gains. I wonder how this will affect a player base who suddenly logs in one day and has never watched a video like this one and suddenly sees that my damage has gone way, way down. I have way less crit. This isn't working as it used to. This feels very strange. What happened? I mean, there's no doubt there's a number of fire mages, demon hunters, shadow priests, etc., who are going to log in on patch day, because the system is probably going to go live in one form or another, and they might have some changes to it, and we should always bear that in mind, and just realize that what's happening here. And then all you know is going to happen is the response is, yeah, Blizzard nerfed the shit out of us. They might not have. They absolutely might not have, but the gameplay difference will be extremely noticeable. Regardless of what they do, the actual change to gameplay will be there. Overall, I think these changes are needed. I would prefer them to have occurred in the beta, as it was pretty obvious this was going to happen. They should have come up with solutions where after a certain amount there's just severe diminishing returns. That would have been easy to implement as well. They've done that in the past. I don't know why they kept the system just keep going, ramping up and up and up and up and up to absurdity. That would have been fine. I would have been more than happy if I hit 60% crit on my mage. Crit had a severe devaluing effect and was just like, boo, and dropping all the way down. That would have been fine with me. I would like to get more haste. I would like to get more mastery and stuff like that. But they haven't gone that way, and this seems to be the solution. Maybe they will go that way. I don't know. So let's see your thoughts on it, guys. There you go. 715 is implementing these secondary stat changes. We know they're coming. It was what we asked for. It makes sense, but it's got ramifications up the arse. Let's see your thoughts. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.